Michel Laub, I'm happy to meet you here on the stand of Klett-Cotta of the Frankfurt Book Fair. You come from Brazil. You was born in Porto Alegre, and you are a journalist and writer, and you have published your 5th novel in Diário de Queda, also der Tagebuch eines Sturzes, das ist dieses Buch. Your book tells the story of your own grandfather.
Well, it's not really the story of my grandfather. The book is in some ways autobiographical, but not always. And so some of the characters I just made up.
In principle, that doesn't matter because it's not necessary to know the life of an author to understand a book.
Yeah, the important the writer is always like he's a liar. So the thing that he has to do is to lie well, and if the reader believes, it's okay.
You tell also that your grandfather dies when your father was 14. That's also a part of the construction of the story.
Yeah, but
you have seen. I've read your book.
Yeah, that's not true. That's not true.
When did you conceive? When and why did you conceive the idea to write this novel?
It's quite difficult to say. I thought about it maybe 3-4 years before starting to write, and when I started to write, it changed a lot during the process. It always happens when you write a book. I don't know why I write this specific story, but in the beginning I was willing to write something about Judaism and something about memory. In some way the book is about these two subjects, but not in the way that I imagined before in the first time.
It seems that your grandfather that you imagine has never told something of himself.
No, that's a pure fictional character. I didn't have this in my family, but I thought it was a good thing to relate a character who could not speak about himself with the subject of memory, and specific with the historical memory about something very significant as the Second War and the Holocaust, and it would be a good contrast between somebody who wants to forget something and a history fact that needs to be remembered all the time.
Yes. What's the real connection in your novel between this sort of a deliberate decision of the grandfather not to tell something about the past and the reconstruction of the past? Where's the connection?
I guess it's something to do with the relation between the individual memory and the historical memory. The historical memory is something that you always need to remember, to not to don't do mistakes again, for instance, historical mistakes, to don't repeat the horror or something like this. And when you are in the video, you're not, it's different, because sometimes you need to forget something to go and go through your life. Otherwise, you are going to be always stick to the past. So that contradiction interests me a lot, and I thought it would be a good fiction material.
The novel, in a certain sense, is also a form of a diary, isn't it?
It's most readers think so, but in the first place, that form was a way for me to put the intense and intuitive feelings that I have about this subject in the paper. You know, you just put there, and after that you organize a little bit. And the way of organizing it afterwards, I put this all of this stuff in the paper, was to organize it in small paragraphs with numbers, so that I would not have the obligation to have a very linear and rational and controlled text.
Now, the numbers are not so very important, because sometimes you begin a new chapter with what I know already a bit more about my grandfather.
These are like false lists. So the titles of the chapters, like things I know about my father, things I know about my grandfather, they are like a cover, like a disguise or something. You pretend that you are doing a list, like 1, 2, 3, 4, but then at the same time you can write something, a continuous text, which liberates me of the obligation to have a continuous test, so I can pretend that I could do something very fragmentary, but in the same time I'm working in the text to make it more coherent and not so fragmentary.
That's interesting. What is more important in the story, the diaries of your grandfather or the stories of the father?
I think they're both the same, actually. One is losing his memory because he has Alzheimer's disease, and the other is trying to forget. So, and the guy who is losing his memory is trying to remember, and the guy who didn't lose his memory because he was a survivor, a concentration camp survivor, he was trying to forget. So one is the opposite of the other, and the two of them are speaking about the same thing, memory. The grandfather was speaking or represents the historical memory, the collective memory, and the father, who has Alzheimer's, represents the individual memory, the biological one, which is very harmed by a disease who makes him lose the memory.
There's another story also in the book. That's the relationship to the students, to your friends in the class. One who is jumping. What is the signification of this jumping?
Yeah, the fall. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same as I told about memory. You have two sides of the same story. In the case of the colleague of the narrator, a guy for whom he did very bad when he was a teenager. It's also a story about tolerance and prejudice, and one guy is Jewish, another one is not. So sometimes the oppressor is the narrator. Sometimes the victim is the narrator. So all the time the book is putting things in opposite perspective. So sometimes the Jews are the victims, sometimes the Jews are the oppressors, and this thing interests me because I'm not writing. I didn't write a book about Jews. I wrote a book about human beings. So when you put everything in this perspective, you start to see that the history repeats itself in a lot of ways, and you don't have always the same groups, the same historical or political groups as victims or oppressors.
Could you imagine that it would be very hard to reconstruct the historical facts if your grandfather had really lived?
Yeah, it would be. It's the writer always fights against his own limits, and one of his limits sometimes is his own relationships, family ones, for instance. And maybe if I was born here in Germany and if I live here in Germany, I would have much more difficulty to write about concentration camps or something like this. So for me, it's a kind of freedom to be in another country. I'm in South America, and not to have a grandfather that was the same character of the book, because it gave me a bit more freedom to speak about this specific.
Like a certain distance.
Yeah.
Your book deals with history. Who has meant the history of the family in your book, but the roots of history do mint us today also, isn't it so?
Always. The history is. History it doesn't serve. It's not useful if it's not a lesson for the present. You always the present is a result of history. So studying history or looking at the things that happen in history is a kind of comprehension of what's happening now.
Yeah, you have already mentioned the last idea, which I won't ask you, but may I ask it once more? Your book is a sort of liberation, an effort to understand what has happened in these years.
Yeah, and in the same ways, it's ambiguous because it's a liberation for the new generations. For instance, you say, "Oh, the world is like this. The world is a succession." The world is a long line of massacres and tragedies, so you have to know this. But in the same time, we are living in our world, so we can, in some way, have do the things that we would like to do, because we are not, we don't need to be jailed to the past or something like this. But in the same time, the past is what we live also. So it's ambiguous. You have maybe you have the illusion that you are that you are free, and maybe we are not really free. But we have to act. I think we have to act as we have as we have many more choices that we actually have. That's a good way of living. You understand the past, you live now, whatever, in the way you want. But with the two things in extreme points of your life, and you are in the middle of them. And sometimes you go a little bit for one side, and sometimes to the other side.
Who should read your book?
Who?
Who should read your book?
Everybody. I hope so.
Thank you very much.